Our next speaker, our second overseas speaker, is Jorgen Johnsson from the University of Gothenburg. He is going to talk to us about the Smoltpro program in Sweden, which I understand is a sustainable smolt production and integrated approach. Over to you, thank you.
Thank you, David, and thanks to the organizers for inviting a Swede like me to this quite British meeting. So I hope I can give you a little Scandinavian Swedish perspective on some aspects of the pros and cons of production of hatchery smolts. So just a brief background, most of the major salmon producing rivers in Sweden was exploited for hydroelectric power starting in the 1930s, 40s. In connection with that, the power companies were obliged by court to, as a compensation, release large number of hatchery-produced smolt. So that business went on while the wild salmon gradually declined, but to start with, the return rates of the hatchery-produced smolts were quite okay, say in the 1960s, 70s. But in recent years, these numbers of returning hatchery smolts have declined, and a relatively recent evaluation from the Swedish Fisher Board suggests that it's not longer economically defensible. So the problem, of course, is when you have this exploitation on this scale, you have all destroyed both the spawning grounds, most of them also the nursing grounds. So it's difficult to find options to stocking which are not astronomically expensive. So the question is then, can the hatchery rearing methods be improved, and would that help? So that's mainly what this talk and project are about. So Smoltpro is a 4-year strategic project funded by the Swedish Research Council Formas. It started in January 2010. It includes a number of researchers, postdocs and PhDs from Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway and Denmark, and also from Canada, which is Professor Ian Fleming, who has a role in this project as well. So here you can see, if you have a good eyesight, you may recognize some of the fish biologists on this picture, or not. But this is from a meeting in Norway, in early one. So the aims were to develop ecological and ethically sound methods for supplementary rearing of salmonids. Whether such methods exist, I don't know, but that's the aim, using a multidisciplinary approach. And the sort of ultimate aim is to try to increase the socioeconomic returns, of course. That's why they give us money for it. But as you know, this is not the easiest thing to do. But that's what we're trying to do. So, the Smoltpro is organized in 5 work groups. So we have sort of a hatchery experimental part. We're looking at post-release performance like migration and also at return rates ultimately. We also have meta-analysis. As if you have been in this business for a while, which I know many of you like me have, you know there's thousands of publications on smolt biology in various ways. It would be quite stupid not to try to use that. So we're trying to use that, but we're not ready with it yet. And we also have a part, of course, with stakeholder interactions and outreach. That's actually what I'm doing right now, I hope. And we also have an economic and ethical part in it. So it's based on experiment in hatchery model systems, which in Scandinavia with a little bit variable climate zones. For example, here in Denmark, you only produce 1-year smolts. Up here, traditionally, a large proportion of 2-year-old smolts. And here is a little bit in between. In Norway, it's mainly 1-year-old smolt in Imsa there, for example. So this is Norrfors Compensatory Hatchery involved, managed by Vattenfall. It's a major hydroelectric power authority in Sweden. We have Älvkarleby, which is monitored by University of Agricultural Sciences, Dalälven. And we have the IMSA research station, which is managed by the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research. And we have the Randers Danish Center for Wild Salmon Hatchery. And we also have some experiment in Canada, which I won't go into at this talk, but they are there. So, as I said, manipulation of hatchery rearing of various kinds, various features, tracking of movements, patterns, behavior, swim performance, various lab analysis of physiology, stress measurements, and so on. And also, we're going to try to look at return rates. So as you know, when you do progress, it takes a while before results come. So we can say our first publications have just come this year. So the major output going to be the next 2-3 years, but there is something coming, I hope. So, and I'm going to show you some actually unpublished results mostly on these effects of density manipulation, a little bit about feeding, and structural enrichment. So you're the first to see this, almost. This is the first published study in Smoltpro. It was published in Canadian Journal this year, and it investigates effects of enriching the hatchery with structure. We come back to the pros and cons of that, which I'm sure people can have opinions on. What we find here, it generally structural enrichment reduces stress. It reduces the basal cortisol levels of the fish in this study. It also reduces fin damage and affects behavior. So, not so surprisingly, fish are reared in structure. They're better at using structure, which can be important after release to escape and hide and things like that. Now I'm going to show just a few examples from results we found for these various methods. I also want to stress, since there have been discussions about genetics earlier, that if you manipulate environment during development, salmon and fish are very plastic, so it has a big effect. So if you do that for a number of generations, it will also, you have gene-environment interaction, but you can also have genetic effects. So it's important to stress that environmental and genetic effects, they're not separate, but so this is, I would say generally for one-year-old smolts, we didn't find any positive effects of reducing food, and that's probably because in the Scandinavian climate zone, you need to grow up the fish fast, otherwise they won't reach the smolt size. But for 2-year-old smolts, there you have the problem that they tend to grow too big, so they sort of growing out of the window instead. So there we found a number of studies that it sometimes can be good to hold back the food on the 2-year-old smolts. So in this study, which is from Norrfors in Umeå, I won't go into details, but you have one group that starting to reduce the food a bit after a while. And then the last period before you release the fish, you starve them completely. And you will see here it has a positive effect on the migration speed. So starvation for a limited time before release has stronger effect on migration speed than food reduction for a longer time in this case. And that's probably important because if you don't migrate out of the system as a smolt, you will get eaten by pike and stuff during the migration route. So it can be important for fitness. But as I said, this effect we mainly find in 2-year-old fish. What we find in almost all experiments we've done, at least on 1-year-old fish, is positive effect of reducing conventional rearing densities. And what's interesting that a previous speaker mentioned these kinds of effects earlier. We found the same. This is a bit strange, but what it simply means is this is the physical barrier, a measure of the physical barrier of the intestine of the fish, which you can measure by electric resistance. So if that barrier is compromised, pathogens and other bad things can leak into the intestine and infect the fish. So it's a measure of resistance to infection, basically. It's connected to that very strongly. And in this case, we found no effect of structure, but if you reduce the density, you have a better primary barrier here. So the first barrier is the skin epidermis of the fish who protect you, and the second one in the intestine. This is studied by Snuttan Sundell's group. So this can be quite important, of course, for disease resistance in the fish. And there's other indicators which is in line with this, like cortisol, for example. So this can be a result of chronic stress, a long-term effect. This is a very recent data from Denmark when the fish are released and you have a pit tag array system that detects their down migration in a 15-kilometer river stretch. So this is one of those readers. You can see the dates in spring here. So the red curve is low-density fish, and the blue is high-density. And as you see, the migration proportion is significantly higher in low-density fish, so it's an effect size of around 15-20%. I should mention that the electrofish, this whole stream after migration, didn't find a single fish, which suggests if you don't migrate out there, you're dead. There's a lot of heron and pike and stuff in that area. So this is quite a clear effect. I was surprised, I must say, it was so strong. This is very preliminary. Only Neil knows about it. So we have starting to get some spawning returns in IMSA for the 1C winter fish. And you don't have to worry about the small things now, so because there's treatments both on density and food, but what it looks like is that we have a higher spawning return of fish reared in low density compared to high density so far. We don't know what it looks at the second. We also have return migration over second winter fish, and this is not the complete data, so very preliminary, but I got so excited so I had to show it. We'll see what happens. So that's just some examples of data which will be published, I hope, and a lot of other data that we can evaluate in a wider context also, hopefully. So to summarize, if you look at reduced rearing density, it generally results in improved performance, especially at least in 1-year-old smolt. We haven't seen it in 2-year-old smolt. I almost said they're useless anyway, but I didn't say that. So they're growing to be. So maybe, but in 1-year smolt we found it. Generally reduced risk and fin damage. It strengthens an intestinal primary barrier against infections. Previous studies on brown trout parr suggest it also helps developing more adaptive behavior in terms of foraging behavior, anti-predator behavior, competitive ability, and a range of other behaviors. So we found increased smolt migration in 3 separate hatchery studies, which I only mentioned one in detail now. The effect may be less strong in the others, but it's in the same direction, so to speak. This is very preliminary, but it could result in increasing return rates then. And of course, in general, if we have positive effects of this, it needs to be evaluated against increased production cost for area if you reduce density in hatcheries. And that's something we will look at also. When it comes to structural enrichment, I know several people in the audience who works with this. Our experience is the results are variable. It's positive in some studies. Also here we found that it can reduce stress and fin damage, increase sheltering behavior, like I said. We had a number of studies that may suggest that structure has interactive effect with density. So if you have a low density, it works well, but if you have a high density, it can actually make situation worse. We have in some studies, and that may be because you have so high density, so the structure will add to the density itself, or too few individuals can utilize it at high density. So we don't know where to look more at that, but can be worth thinking about when it comes to methodology in hatcheries in general, I think. And it's the same, you have hatchery things you need to think about. For example, many hatchery managers don't like to have increased cleaning costs, and you can also have increased infection risks, which I completely understand. So it has to be evaluated, but it's also very many ways that you can increase structural complexity. You can also work with water current variability and other things. So it's not only plants and stuff we need to talk about necessarily. Feed reduction variable result depending on smolt size and age. No or negative effects on smolt propagation in 1-year-old smolt, because sometimes in our climates they're close to be too small. So if they reduce them further, they're simply not big enough to migrate. So then you shouldn't do it, basically. The positive effect on migration in several studies on 2-year-old smolt. So if they're sort of risking to getting too big or fat, either they may not be motivated to go out because it's so nice in the hatchery. So you have to make them feel a bit bad. Or it can also be hydrodynamic effects on swimming ability if the fish are too big and fat that impairs smolt migration, or both, or something else that we don't know about yet. So maybe affected on larger smolts to stimulate migration behavior. So we need further study to delimit under which conditions this should be used or not. But size dependent, I think, is one thing. How am I with time? I'm okay. So we're going to take this data then and compare it with other data in a meta-analysis, put it into economical models and so on, and look more into it, of course, the nearest 1-2 years. So some final general thoughts, and this is my subjective thoughts, I think. So far our results suggest reduction of conventional rear density is the most promising general way to increase quality of 1-year hatchery at smolts. Alternative modifications, as I already said, may be useful depending on local conditions, age and size, and so on. In general, our results, like some previously have said today, suggest that an increased focus on quality rather than quantity is critical for sustainable supplementary smolt production, if it is feasible at all. So we also have, a law problem here, because it's decided in Sweden. It's decided by court how many salmon smolt should be put out for a certain river. So, and those court decisions are not easy to change. So you have that aspect to think about too. I'm sure some of you may have similar aspect to think about when it comes to that. So if increased smolt quality should boost return rate, will this compensate for increased production cost? Economic analyses are on the way, and they will be done by Anders Gonhoft and Ola Dieserud in Norway and Kjetil Hindar. Finally, there is an ethical aspect. At least in Sweden, the ethical welfare regulations are getting more and more strict all the time. And the goal of supplementary Smoltpro must also be to minimize stress and also allow natural behavior to be expressed to some extent. That's actually not possible with these modifications we have looked at either, but at least it's going on the right way, so to speak. At least I think so. Yeah, I think there was this, and we have a homepage, so when we present new articles and information that comes out and so on, so if you want to follow what happens in Smoltpro, or if you want to contact us, you can follow our web page, or you can contact me if you have ideas or suggestions for meta-analysis, data, and anything. So that was what I had to say, and thank you.
There's time for one quick question now, if anyone has one. Yes, sir.
I just wondered what is the current opinion on releasing hatchery smolts into wild salmon populations in Scandinavia?
Debated.
It's debated.
Yeah. There have been discussions in EU to stop hatchery releases in the Baltic completely. It's debated whether that's going to happen or not. So we have some scientists who think it should be stopped entirely, and then we have the whole range. The thing is, I don't think it's the best thing either. The problem is it's difficult to find an alternative with the present situation because those habitats are destroyed. I don't know if you've been up to North Sweden, but it looks terrible. So if you would to fix the habitat, that would cost a fortune, and so in a way it's the only way to maintain that specific population, although I agree with geneticists that can also change, as we've already seen today, due to genetic changes. If they try to use wild parents, but still you get the change. So it is in a way a no-win situation. But so it's really debated right now. Actually, many views on it. I'm sure it is here as well. So I'm not categorical myself. But another thing is, since water power is a renewable energy source, I doubt that the demand for water power will go down in the future. I would predict it will go up. So I think, unfortunately, we're stuck. Maybe they can do some improvements, but that's my opinion.